Alrighty, so in this video we're going to talk about a very important concept in Gulp, and that is how to create multiple tasks and how those tasks can relate to each other and be ran in series or parallel, all that fun stuff, how we can combine these tasks. Now the reason we really need this is because generally a Gulp task is going to do one very specific thing. It'll pretty much all follow this format: gulp.source, blah blah blah, gulp.dest. And obviously compiling scripts in this particular way isn't the only thing we want to do in this build script, so we need to introduce additional tasks. And we need to relate those tasks to each other. So generally speaking, keep your tasks small and short and clean and specific to one task. You can create as many tasks as you want to. So we already have seen one way we can define a Gulp task. We do gulp.task, specify a name for that task, in this case default, which by the way, I can run Node or Gulp default if I wanted to. I can also see that default is available by running gulp-tasks. But what if I wanted to register another task in a different way? What if I just wanted to, let's just create an empty, a naked function and call this dev styles. And this is just, we're going to actually go out, and in this video we're going to compile our less file. But for now I'll just go ahead and do my callback so that Gulp doesn't complain. Now, creating that naked function here, you could consider this function to be a task, but Gulp doesn't know anything about it. If I just run Gulp tasks again, notice that default is currently the only one listed. It's not a public task that's available to be ran by the command line. So how do we register it? Well, not surprisingly, we use the Gulp task function. So there's two ways to go about doing this. I can say gulp.task, and I can just say dev styles. I can literally just reference this function. Now, the cool thing about this is this takes advantage of JavaScript's hoisting feature or behavior, I guess would be a better term for it, where if we declare a function in this way, or a variable in this way, we can reference that from other parts above that. So we can reference this function from line 4, even though it's defined on line 13, because we defined it in this particular way. Now if I run Gulp tasks, we have now registered another task, dev styles, and I can invoke it by saying gulp dev styles. And it gets invoked. Of course, it doesn't do anything, but it gets invoked. But the way I'm going to define this is I don't like using camel casing for my Gulp tasks. I prefer to use colons as a delineator. So I want this to be dev colon styles. Now, obviously, we can't go in here and change the function name to dev colon styles because that's not valid JavaScript. But, not surprisingly, what we can do is say dev colon styles up here. So we're defining a task called dev colon styles, and we are setting it to this function. And now I can come here and say gulp. Now dev styles without the colon no longer works, but I can say gulp dev styles. And it compiles. All right, so before we talk about how we can combine tasks, let's go ahead and compile less. This is basically going to be the exact same process that we went through with Babel, so it's whatever. So let's just go ahead and do that real fast. Not surprisingly, there is a Gulp plugin called gulp-less. So let's go ahead and install that with npm. I'm going to say npm install gulp-less save dev. Of course, this is a development dependency. It's not something we need for runtime. So we're going to go ahead and install it. You can feel free to hop on over to the npmjs.org to read about the different options you can provide to gulp-less. But anyway, that brought in gulp-less, and it also brought in an installation of less for us, which is awesome of it. So I can come up here, and I can simply say less equals require gulp-less. And to use it, we use it in the exact same way that Babel's used. Pretty much most Gulp plugins follow this same sort of process, where we import the plugin, and then we simply pipe to the plugin, invoking it, and optionally passing in parameters. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to remove the callback parameter from dev styles, and I'm simply going to say return gulp.source source styles, and I'm not going to do a glob here. I'm going to plug directly into site.less. I'll tell you why in a second. And then I'm going to say pipe invoke the less plugin, and then I'm going to pipe it to gulp.dest and send it to public styles. Now, if I were to go ahead and say gulp dev styles, we get an awesome error because header less wasn't found. That's something from a previous video attempt. You did not see that. Anyway, removing the obviously incorrect code, we went ahead and we ran gulp dev styles. And if we hop over into public styles, oh, I messed up something again, didn't I? Let's see here. No, I actually did not mess up. Visual Studio Code decided not to see that file. It didn't recognize that a new file was created, so I just hit this handy little refresh button up here and it shows up. And if I open up site.css, we see that less did indeed process it. We know less processed it, of course, because we used a nested rule in the source, and then it got compiled into straight up CSS, so we know less is working now, and that's awesome. Before we move on, I want to point out that yes, I'm not using a glob for this. Depending on what you're doing and how your site is organized, you might have just one master less file that includes all of your styles for your entire application that you want compiled into a single CSS file. You might have a handful of kind of entry point less files where those individual ones are all packaged up into their own CSS file, or you might want each of your less files being compiled by yourself or individually. Like for example, if I come in here and add that header.less that you don't know anything about because you saw nothing, I can come here and just say .header and say color red, and then I can come here to site.less, and let's say I go ahead and import it. Now the cool thing about this, and this is particularly cool for single page applications, is that when I go and compile this less, we get a single site.css that includes both the files because we imported the header file. Now, if you didn't want to do that, you could go ahead and remove that and come into your gulp file, and you can certainly pass in a glob if you wanted to. So I can say glob.less, and I can run gulp dev styles, and of course, now I'm going to get header.css and site.css. But I generally don't do this. I generally combine all of my less files into a handful of entry point less files. And the reason for that is so I can share my mixins and all that fun stuff. But it's up to you, and it really depends on the application you're writing. Okay, that's enough about less. Really straightforward, basically looks structurally identical to our default. So let's go ahead and write our, get this nasty script stuff out of our default task, because when you go ahead and you download a project online that uses Gulp and you want to build it, the first thing you're going to want to do is just type in Gulp, and you'll think, okay, that's going to build all my stuff, because generally it's a convention that your default task will build all of your development stuff for you. So let's refactor this out. I'm going to say gulp.task, and I'm going to say dev scripts, and I'm going to say dev scripts, which is a function that doesn't exist yet, but it will in a second. Down here, I'm going to say dev scripts, and then I'm just going to take all this code out of default, and I'm going to dump it in here. Now I can come here, and if I type in gulp and run the default task, well, I get that nasty error because I don't have a callback, but I can now go ahead and, as you can see right here, I can go ahead and write gulp dev scripts. Now, the most important thing, the thing that I wanted to really talk about in this video, is how do we combine styles and scripts? Let's make it a little bit more interesting, actually, before I show you guys the syntax. Let's say that it's even more complicated. Let's say I have a clean task right here. Say I have a clean task that takes a second to run, and I want this task to be executed before styles and before scripts. So there's a couple ways to do this. One way is, instead of passing in a function to gulp.task, we can pass in a special parameter. We can pass in gulp.series, and then I can pass in clean to run first, then dev styles to run next, and then dev scripts to run after that. Now check this out. If I do gulp tasks now, notice how my default task runs a series of clean followed by styles followed by scripts. So that's really cool. That's how you'll compose your gulp tasks. And I want to point this out right now. We'll talk about this in a later video. This is the big difference. One of the big differences between Gulp 3 and Gulp 4. Like I said, Gulp 3 and Gulp 4 are functionally equivalent as far as the innards, but it has a new orchestrator, a new task running system that deals with dependencies a lot differently and a lot more powerful. In fact, this is going to be this is the killer feature of Gulp 4. I mean, the reason why I would suggest using it. But anyway, I'm not so happy with this. I know I just talked about how much I love this, and I was like, I'm not so happy. Well, the reason I'm not happy with this is the whole thing about Gulp and the whole thing about Node in general is really encouraging asynchronosity. There's no reason why my styles and my scripts can't run simultaneously. I have a quad-core processor, and not only that, most of these tasks are mostly I/O bound anyway. So why can't I run them simultaneously? You can't. And instead of using Gulp.series, we can, not surprisingly, use Gulp.parallel. So I can say Gulp.parallel. I know I don't spell very good. Gulp.parallel instead of Gulp.series. And now if I go ahead and say Gulp default. Well, actually, I never showed you guys what happened when I did series. So let's go ahead and just do this real fast. Okay, clean starts. It pauses for a second. Then style starts. Then style ends. Then script starts. Script ends. And then default ends. Right? So that's what happens when we're in series. If we're in parallel, we get a much different and more appropriate behavior. Now, all of the tasks run at the same time. Notice how this cleaned message gets dumped out here way after it got started, even after the styles got finished in 303 milliseconds. But now you see styles and scripts are running at the same time. They both took 300 milliseconds to execute. So I've effectively doubled my build throughput. It's very, very important to parallelize as much as you possibly can. But now we have a problem. The problem is that a clean task generally does things like go to your destination directory. Do I have to refresh again? I do. Go to your destination directory and delete all of the previously built items. Well, why would that be problematic? Well, if clean is running at the same time as these items are being generated, we're going to have a race condition. We're going to have files that will just magically disappear. We don't want that. I will go ahead and change this real fast. I don't want to use this glob for this. I want to use site.less, and I don't want header.css to be there. Go away. Rebuild. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, the awesome thing is you could probably guess, we can combine parallel and serial. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to do gulp.parallel, followed by a clean dev styles dev scripts. I'm just going to format this a little differently. I'm going to remove clean from this parallel invocation, and above it, I'm going to say gulp.series, and I'll do some indentation here to make it clear what's going on. And then inside the gulp series, I'm going to say clean, followed by a gulp parallel of dev styles and dev scripts. And maybe we have something all the way at the end. Maybe publish, right? So maybe we want to publish our, have the default task publish our artifacts, which would actually be kind of a silly thing to do, but whatever. This isn't production code. It's just an example. I can take some liberties, can't I? So we have a publish task that takes a second to run, right? So we want it to clean our directory, we want to run our styles and our scripts in parallel, and then we want to finish off by publishing serially. So I come up here, and I simply say publish, so that our, now parenthesis matching is a very important feature when you're doing stuff like this. You could make this potentially more clear by doing this. You'll sometimes see people write out their stuff like that. It does... honestly, it does look cleaner, but it takes up so much vertical space. I don't like this style, so I'm just going to collapse my parentheses like that. But anyway, if you want a diagram of how this is going to work, simply run gulp tasks, and that'll tell you exactly how your hierarchy is working. So we open up a series, we clean, and then in parallel we style and we script, and then we publish. So if I go ahead and run gulp default, or just gulp, we clean, we run our scripts and styles in parallel, and then we publish after scripts and styles are done. So it's very, very important to understand how we can combine tasks together. Okay, there's a couple other interesting things to note. So notice that clean and publish are private, I'm finger quoting, private tasks. They're still tasks in the sense that they're functions that either take a callback or return a string. But they're not exposed. You don't see them anywhere in the root when I run gulp task. You do see them being referenced inside of another task, but you don't see them referenced from the root. And that's sometimes what you want. You might want to create these little helper build steps that you don't want gulp to know about. Of course, we can declare them by saying something like gulp task clean, or just clean if I wanted to do that as well. And now I can say gulp clean and run that directly. But I still can't say gulp publish because publish isn't being exposed. And there's another bit of syntax here. So right here, we're referencing the functions directly. You're not necessarily required to do so. If you have a task that's being published, you can reference it with a string off of its published name. So instead of dev styles, I can do dev styles. It'll have the exact same behavior. So if I run gulp tasks, notice how dev styles is still right there. But now it's dev styles. Now you see the string representation right there, but it's still going to invoke dev styles. I can prove that by running gulp and see that dev styles is indeed invoked. It's the same logic. It just appears slightly differently. Now, some people like doing that for all of their public build steps. Some people like just passing in the function name directly. It's useful if you don't have the function name handy, like maybe it was defined in another module and wasn't exported, and so on and so on. But just to be clear, there's two ways that you can pass in these things into gulp serial and Gulp.parallel. But that's really it. As far as how to combine our scripts, we'll look at different organizational methods for our tasks in a later video. Next up, I probably would be a good idea to just take a step back and talk a little bit about gulp internals. Because at the end of the day, really all gulp is it's a task runner, and it's a special file system, and then it takes advantage of streams, and then it has a bunch of plugins. So I want to remove as much of the magic from gulp as possible, because it's really, really, really simple once you get down to it. It's using straight up Node libraries that are even documented on the Node website. So we're going to take a look at that. And then in a later video, we're going to talk about things like source maps and minification and watching and all of that fun stuff. But yeah, I guess next up, let's start talking about the internals, and I'll see you guys there.